The champagne glass slipped from Richard Caldwell's hand, shattering against the marble floor of the Metropolitan Gala Ballroom. 200 guests turned to look, but Richard saw only one thing: the antique emerald necklace glittering around his assistant's throat, the same necklace he'd buried with his wife 3 years ago. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the orchestra. But there it was, the distinctive platinum setting, the 3 emeralds arranged in a teardrop pattern, the tiny inscription on the clasp that read, "Forever RC." His assistant, Elena Martinez, stood frozen across the room, her hand instinctively moving to her neck. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Richard saw something he'd never noticed in the 5 years she'd worked for him: fear. Have you ever discovered that everything you believed about someone was a lie? That's exactly what happened to Richard Caldwell that night, and what he uncovered in the following weeks would shatter his understanding of the past and change his future forever. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and stay with me until the end, because what happened in this story, nobody was prepared to see. Richard Caldwell was 48 years old and looked every bit the successful tech mogul the magazines portrayed him as. Tall, with silver threading through his dark hair, he commanded rooms with his presence. His company, Caldwell Technologies, had revolutionized cloud computing and made him a fortune estimated at $3 billion. But all the money in the world hadn't saved his wife, Catherine, from the cancer that took her at 39. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of moving through life mechanically, building his empire higher while feeling nothing inside. His penthouse apartment overlooking Boston Harbor was immaculate and empty. His calendar was full of meetings that meant nothing, and his assistant, Eleanor, kept everything running with quiet efficiency. Eleanor Martinez was 32, unremarkable in the way she seemed to prefer. She wore conservative business suits in navy and gray, kept her dark hair in a simple bun, and spoke only when necessary. She'd been with Caldwell Technologies for 5 years, promoted to Richard's executive assistant 3 years ago, right after Catherine's death. And in all that time, Richard realized with sudden clarity he'd never really looked at her until tonight, until the necklace. The gala continued around them, but Richard moved through the crowd like a man in a trance. Elena had disappeared, slipped out while he was still staring at the space where she'd stood. He found himself on the terrace, the October wind cutting through his tuxedo, his mind racing. The necklace had been Catherine's most treasured possession. It had belonged to her grandmother, who'd received it from her husband on their 50th wedding anniversary. Catherine wore it on their wedding day. She wore it to every important event. And when she died, Richard had placed it around her neck one final time, a promise that some part of their love would go with her into whatever came next. So how was it around Elena's neck at a charity gala 3 years later? The drive home was a blur. Richard's driver Thomas tried making small talk, but gave up when Richard didn't respond. All Richard could think about was that necklace, glittering under the ballroom lights. There had to be an explanation, a replica perhaps, some kind of misunderstanding. But he knew that necklace. He'd held it in his hands 1,000 times. He'd fastened the clasp around Catherine's neck on their 10th anniversary, on their 20th, on the night before she entered hospice. He knew every detail of it, including the tiny imperfection in the largest emerald, a small inclusion that looked like a star if you held it to the light just right. That was Catherine's necklace, he was certain. By Monday morning, Richard had made a decision. He arrived at his office early, before Eleanor would be at her desk. He needed to think, to plan his approach. Confronting her at the gala would have caused a scene. But here, in the controlled environment of his office, he could demand answers. Eleanor arrived at 8 o'clock, exactly on time as always. Through the glass wall of his office, Richard watched her settle at her desk, turn on her computer, check his calendar for the day. She wore a grey suit and pearl earrings. Her movements were practiced, efficient. She looked exactly as she always did, except she didn't come into his office for their usual morning briefing. At 8:30, Richard's phone buzzed. A text from Elena. "I resign, effective immediately. My letter is in your email. I'm sorry." Richard bolted from his office, but Elena's desk was already empty. Her computer was off, her personal items gone. In the 5 years she'd worked for him, she'd accumulated almost nothing in her workspace. No photos, no plants, no personal touches. Now there was nothing at all to indicate she'd ever been there. He called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. He checked her employee file and found an address in Dorchester, a working-class neighborhood 20 minutes from downtown. Within an hour, Richard was in his car, driving across the city with a single-minded determination that would have alarmed him if he'd stopped to think about it. The address led to a 3-story brick apartment building that had seen better days. The directory showed E. Martinez in apartment 2B. Richard pressed the buzzer. No answer. He pressed it again, holding it down. Nothing. "She left this morning," a voice said behind him. An elderly woman with a grocery cart stood on the sidewalk. Saw her loading suitcases into a taxi around 7. Looked like she was in a hurry. "Do you know where she went?" The woman shook her head. "Kept to herself, that one. Lived here for 5 years, and I maybe spoke to her a dozen times. Always polite, always quiet, but private, you know. Some people are just private. 5 years, the same amount of time she'd worked for him." Richard thanked the woman and returned to his car, his mind churning. Elena had planned this. The moment he saw the necklace, she'd known she had to run, which meant she knew exactly where it came from and why seeing it would shake him. Back at his office, Richard did what he should have done years ago. He looked into Elena Martinez's background. Really looked. Her employment application showed a degree in business administration from Boston University, excellent references from previous employers, and a clean background check. Everything was in order. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. Richard called his head of security, Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent who handled sensitive matters for the company. "I need you to dig into someone's background, deep. I want to know everything." By the end of the day, Marcus sat in Richard's office with a file folder and a troubled expression. "This is strange, Mr. Caldwell, very strange. Tell me." "Elena Martinez exists on paper, but barely. The address she gave us. She's been there 5 years, pays rent in cash, has no visitors that neighbors can recall. The degree from BU, real, but I spoke to some professors who should have remembered her, and nobody does. It's like she attended classes just enough to not fail, never made an impression on anyone." "What about before she came to Boston?" "That's where it gets interesting. Her previous employment references check out on the surface, but when I dug deeper, I found something odd. One of those companies went out of business 6 months before she claimed to work there. The reference letter is dated a year after they closed." Richard felt his stomach tighten. "So her entire background is fabricated." "Not entirely. Some of it's real, but it's been enhanced, augmented, like someone took a real person and added layers of fiction to make her more employable." Marcus leaned forward. "Mr. Caldwell, I have to ask, why am I investigating your assistant? What happened?" Richard told him about the necklace, about Catherine's burial, about Elena's sudden disappearance. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You're thinking she stole it from your wife's grave?" "I don't know what I'm thinking. That's why I need you to find her." It took Marcus 3 days. 3 days during which Richard barely slept, couldn't focus on work, and snapped at everyone. Around him, his company was negotiating a major merger, but all he could think about was Elena and that necklace. On the 3rd day, Marcus returned with an address. "She's staying at a motel in New Hampshire, small place off the highway. She paid cash for a week." Richard didn't wait. He was in his car within minutes, driving north with a determination that bordered on obsession. The October landscape blurred past, trees ablaze with fall colors, small towns with white church steeples, the slow transition from city to country. He barely noticed any of it. The Blue Pine Motel was exactly the kind of place people went to disappear. Cheap, anonymous, cash only. Richard found Elena's room number from a bored desk clerk who barely looked up from his phone. Room 7, ground floor, around the back. Richard stood outside the door for a long moment, his fist raised to knock. What was he doing here? What did he expect to accomplish? But the image of that necklace wouldn't leave his mind, and before he could second-guess himself, he knocked. The door opened a crack, the chain still engaged. Elena's face appeared in the gap, and Richard saw immediately that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale. "Mr. Caldwell, I knew you'd come. We need to talk." "I know." She closed the door, and Richard heard the chain sliding free. When the door opened again, Elena stood there in jeans and a sweater, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "Come in." The motel room was depressing. Faded bedspread, water-stained ceiling, the smell of old cigarette smoke despite the no smoking sign. Eleanor had been there 3 days, but the room showed no signs of occupancy except for a single suitcase in the corner. "The necklace," Richard said without preamble. "Where did you get it?" Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. "From Catherine. She gave it to me 2 days before she died." The room seemed to tilt. "That's impossible." "Was with her every day. You never visited her." "Yes, I did. When you went home to shower and change, when you took breaks to meet with your lawyers about the will, when you finally let the hospice nurses convince you to get a few hours of sleep. I was there." Elena looked up at him, and her eyes were full of pain. "I was always there, Mr. Caldwell. You just never saw me." Richard felt his legs go weak. He sat in the room's single chair, his mind reeling. Why? Why would Catherine give you her necklace? You were just my assistant. She barely knew you. "I wasn't just your assistant." Eleanor's voice was steady now, as if she'd decided something. "And Catherine knew me better than you think, better than anyone." "What does that mean?" Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. "I'm going to tell you something, and you're not going to believe me at first. You're going to think I'm crazy, or lying, or both. But it's the truth, Mr. Caldwell, and it's time you knew." "Then tell me." She turned to face him. "My name isn't Elena Martinez, it's Elena Caldwell. I'm your daughter." For a moment, Richard couldn't process the words. They hung in the air between them, impossible and absurd. "I don't have a daughter." "Yes, you do. Catherine and I both knew. She'd known for 3 years before she died." "That's insane." "Catherine and I tried for years to have children. We went through fertility treatments, adoption agencies, everything. We couldn't have children." "You couldn't, but Catherine could." Elena's voice was gentle. "Mr. Caldwell, Dad, Catherine had a brief affair 29 years ago before you were married. She got pregnant. She was only 22, scared and alone. She gave me up for adoption, and it nearly destroyed her." Richard stood abruptly, anger flooding through him. "This is a lie, some kind of sick con to what? Get money? Blackmail me? I don't want your money. I never did." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "Catherine made me promise not to tell you until after she was gone. She was protecting you, but also protecting herself. She was ashamed of keeping this secret for so long." Inside the envelope were letters, dozens of them in Catherine's familiar handwriting. Richard's hands shook as he unfolded the first one. "My dearest Richard," it began, "if you're reading this, then Elena has finally told you the truth. And I am so sorry for not having the courage to tell you myself." Richard read for an hour, tears streaming down his face, as Catherine's words from beyond the grave revealed a secret she'd carried for their entire marriage. The affair had happened during a rough patch between them before they were engaged. She'd gotten pregnant, panicked, and given the baby up for adoption to a couple in New Mexico. For years, she'd lived with the guilt and grief, never telling Richard because she was afraid of losing him. Then, 5 years ago, Elena had found her birth records, adoption agencies, DNA testing. Elena had spent years searching for her biological mother. When she finally found Catherine, she learned that her birth mother was married to a tech billionaire and dying of cancer. I didn't plan to work for you. Elena's voice broke into his reading. I just wanted to meet her, to know her. But when I showed up at the hospital that first time, Catherine begged me to take the job as your assistant. She wanted to see me every day, to make up for the lost years. And she made me promise not to tell you until after she was gone. Why? Why keep it secret? She was dying. She didn't want your last months together to be full of pain and betrayal and anger. She wanted you to remember your love the way it was, not tainted by this. Richard looked at the necklace in the photograph paper clipped to one letter. And the necklace? 2 days before she died, when you'd gone home to shower, she called me into her room. She was so weak by then, barely. Unconscious most of the time, but she was clear that day. She took off the necklace and put it in my hands. Elena's voice broke. She said, "This was supposed to go to my daughter. It's finally going where it belongs." Richard set down the letters and looked at Elena. Really looked at her for the first time. He saw Catherine in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. He saw a stranger who'd worked beside him for 5 years, organizing his life, keeping his secrets, watching him grieve for a woman who was both their loss. You were there. All that time while Catherine was dying, you were there, and I never knew. She didn't want you to know, and I kept my promise. Until the gala. Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. I shouldn't have worn it. It was stupid and reckless, but it was our anniversary, Catherine's and mine, the day she gave me up for adoption. I just wanted to feel close to her, to honor her somehow. I never thought you'd be at the same event. You hate. Gallus, the company insisted. Major donor event. Richard rubbed his face, exhausted. So you ran. What else could I do? I'd kept my promise. Catherine was gone, and now you knew something was wrong. It was time to disappear. To disappear, Richard repeated. Because you thought I'd be angry, aren't you? Richard thought about it. About Catherine's secret, carried for 3 decades. About Eleanor, working beside him for 5 years, watching him grieve, keeping silent out of love for a dying woman. About all the moments he'd missed, the conversations they'd never had, the relationships stolen by secrets and fear. I don't know what I am, he said honestly. I thought I knew everything about Catherine, about my life, and now I find out that for 5 years I've been working next to my daughter without knowing it. I understand if you want me to leave, to disappear for real this time. Richard looked at her. This woman who carried Catherine's eyes and his own stubborn chin, who'd kept a deathbed promise for 3 years, who'd watched him from a distance because she loved a woman who'd given her up at birth. No, he said quietly, I don't want you to disappear. I've lost enough. Over the next weeks, Richard and Elena began the slow, awkward process of getting to know each other, not as employer and assistant, but as father and daughter. They met for coffee, for walks in the park, for long dinners where they traded stories about Catherine and slowly revealed themselves to each other. Richard learned that Elena had grown up in Albuquerque, raised by loving adoptive parents who died in a car accident when she was 23. She'd spent her 20s searching for her birth mother, working odd jobs to fund private investigators and DNA tests. Finding Catherine had been the culmination of years of work, and Catherine's death had left her orphaned all over again. Elena learned that Richard wasn't the cold workaholic she'd observed from her desk. He was lonely, grieving, and lost. The company he'd built meant nothing without Catherine to share it with. He'd been sleepwalking through life, and Eleanor's revelation had been like a bucket of cold water, shocking him back into feeling something, anything, again. 3 months after the gala, Richard made a decision. He called Elena to his office, not the office where she'd sat as his assistant, but his personal office at home, the one filled with photos of Catherine and memories of their life together. I want to make a public announcement, he told her, about who you are, about our relationship. Eleanor looked uncertain. Are you sure? People will have questions, judgments. Catherine's memory is strong enough to withstand the truth. And besides, She wanted you to have a family. She told me so in one of her letters. Richard gestured to the box on his desk, filled with Catherine's correspondence to Elena over the 3 years before her death. She wanted you to have your father, even if she didn't have the courage to give him to you while she was alive. The announcement made headlines. Tech billionaire discovers secret daughter led the business sections. Blogs speculated about paternity, inheritance, and scandal, but Richard didn't care. He held a press conference where he stood beside Elena and told the truth, all of it. About Catherine's youthful mistake, about the adoption, about Elena's search and their reunion. My wife carried a heavy burden, Richard said to the cameras. She was afraid that revealing her secret would destroy our marriage, our love. But what I've learned in these past months is that love doesn't break so easily, and family, real family, is worth fighting for, even when it comes to you in unexpected ways. The public reaction surprised them both. Instead of condemnation, there was overwhelming support. People related to Catherine's story, to Elena's search for her roots, to Richard's willingness to embrace a daughter he'd never known. He had. Letters poured in from adoptees, from birth parents, from families torn apart and reunited. 6 months later, Richard stood in his backyard, a yard he'd barely set foot in since Catherine's death, and watched Eleanor plant a garden. Catherine had loved gardens, had spent hours in this same spot before she got too sick to kneel in the dirt. Now Eleanor was bringing it back to life, planting roses and herbs and vegetables, her hands dark with soil. She would have loved this, Richard said, kneeling beside her. Seeing you here, bringing life back to this place. I think about her every day, Elena said, patting soil around a tomato plant. About all the years we lost, all the moments we could have had. So do I. But we can't change the past. We can only decide what to do with the future. That future, Richard was learning, looked different than he'd imagined. He'd brought Elena into the company in a real role, not as his assistant, but as a project manager working on their charitable foundation. She was good at it, thoughtful and organized, with Catherine's compassionate heart and Richard's head for business. They had dinner every Sunday, a tradition that started awkwardly but grew comfortable. Richard learned about Elena's love of mystery novels, her terrible singing voice, her habit of talking to plants. Elena learned about Richard's secret sweet tooth, his fear of heights, his collection of vintage watches that Catherine had started buying him on anniversaries. They were building something new, something neither of them had planned, but both desperately needed: a family. 1 year after the gala, Richard organized a memorial service for Catherine at the house. Friends and family came, people who'd loved her and mourned her loss. But this time, there was something different. Elena stood at Richard's side, her place in his life acknowledged and celebrated. At the end of the evening, after everyone had gone home, Richard and Elena stood in the garden, Catherine's garden, now Elena's garden too, and looked up at the stars. "Do you think she knows?" Elena asked. "Do you think she can see us?" "I don't know, but I hope so. I hope she knows that her secret didn't destroy us, that it brought us together." Elena reached for Richard's hand, and he took it. These two people who'd lost Catherine but found each other. Around Elena's neck, the emerald necklace caught the moonlight, connecting past and present, mother and daughter, lost and found. "She gave me more than a necklace," Eleanor said softly. "She gave me you." Richard squeezed her hand, tears on his cheeks. "She gave us both a second chance, at family, at love, at not being alone." And in the garden where Catherine had once knelt in the dirt, coaxing life from seeds and soil, two people who'd been strangers stood together, bound by the woman they'd both loved and the truth that had finally set them free. The necklace that had revealed their secret now symbolized something else. The unbreakable connection between a mother who'd never stopped loving the daughter she gave up, a daughter who'd never stopped searching for her roots, and a father who'd found the family he never knew he'd lost. Sometimes the most precious inheritances aren't money or property. Sometimes they're the people we find in unexpected places, the second chances we get to love and be loved, the courage to face uncomfortable truths and build something beautiful from them. Richard Caldwell learned that less than the night, a champagne glass shattered on a ballroom floor, and in learning it he discovered that life, real life, messy and complicated and full of surprises, was just beginning. What would you have done in Richard's place? If you discovered your wife had kept a secret for decades, would you be able to forgive and move forward? That's the question at the heart of this story. If this story touched your heart, leave your like now and comment below. Would you have kept Catherine's secret or told the truth sooner? And tell me, what moved you more? The moment Richard saw the necklace or when Elena revealed who she really was? Do you know someone dealing with adoption, secrets, or complicated family situations? Share this video with them. Your share might change someone's life. And tell me, from what city are you watching? I want to see how far Richard and Elena's story is reaching. If you love emotional stories like this one, write in the comments, "I love these stories," or "loved the story." That way I know you want more content that touches the heart. The bond between Richard and Elena continues to grow stronger every day. Sometimes family comes to us in the most unexpected ways. Already subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories of love, loss, and redemption that will move you even more. Now click on the next story that's already waiting for you. See you there.